Linear fusion rifles haven't really been the talk of the town since, ever, really. However, a couple of things happened recently that may give a little bit of life to linear fusion rifles. Number one is their precision damage got increased by 20%, although this did not end up affecting Sleeper Simulant. And number two is the target acquisition at close to medium ranges was significantly increased. I definitely noticed this increase from Season 8 to Season 9 when using Arbalest in PvP. I was using it in Season 8 to get a Triumph done, and it was a terrible experience at best. Then Season 9 rolls around and I grind out my 125 linear fusion kills for the Komodo 4FR Ritual Crucible weapon in less than a dozen games. All of a sudden, using Arbalest was, dare I say, actually fun in PvP. But we're not here to talk about PvP today. Today we're here to talk about Line in the Sand, the Season 9 linear fusion that came with the Sundial. What makes Line in the Sand special is that it's the only linear fusion rifle right now that can roll with firing line in the entire game. Firing line is a 25% precision damage increase when you're near 2 or more fire team members. As you might know, firing line is probably the one perk that can actually keep stuff like legendary snipers in contention as boss killing weapons versus other high profile exotic weapons. And early in the season, there was a lot of talk about Line in the Sand and its damage capabilities, so you can probably guess where this video is going. Oh, and it's also the only linear fusion in the game that can get rapid hit, allowing for super fast reloads without having to kill something and without the need for Rally Barricade or Lunafactions. Rapid hit times 5 and Rally Barricade are approximately the same speed in terms of reloads though. We did determine a while back that auto-loading holster is important for DPS and rotating your weapons, but seeing as firing line and auto-loading holster are in the same column of perks, linear fusions would need a substantial buff to make holster better than firing line. For this particular test, I tested a range of Line in the Sand linear fusions with rapid hit at various charge speeds: 466, 500, 533, 553, and 566. All testing was done on the Ogre in the Tribute Hall with a 960 Line in the Sand linear fusion, with the exception of the 466, which was at 964 power. However, the damage increase is not statistically significant. I was at 979 power when doing these tests. Charge speed and damage per shot on linear fusions are linked. The faster the charge speed, the lower the damage, and this includes the charge speed masterwork. As we can see here, the 466 charge speed shot deals just under 20,000 damage, while the 566 deals 21,500 damage. What I would like to do in these tests is see if faster charge speeds end up giving you higher or lower DPS compared to slower speeds. The charge time equals how many milliseconds it takes to fire a shot, so 466 would be 466 milliseconds. To test this out, I fired 5 shots as fast and consistently as I could on each charge speed that I had available to me, which were 466, 500, 533, and 566, although I could not for the life of me get a 566 variant of Line in the Sand with firing line, so I got a 553 instead. However, the 553 and 566 charge speeds are so close that I feel like we could just add on a tiny bit of damage to our result and be okay. For our 466 charge speed Line in the Sand, it takes us about 4.5 seconds from the first frame where I see the charge animation starting via particle effects on my screen until the 5th shot is removed from the magazine. This is our highest possible damage window because it negates any post-final shot downtime and any reloads. At 500 speed, it's 4.66 seconds, at 533, it's 4.833 seconds, and at 566, it's 5 seconds. All we need to do now is toss in our damage numbers. 466 charge speed at 964 deals 24,595 with firing line. 5 shots is 122,975 damage in 4.5 seconds, a DPS of 27,328. 500 charge speed at 960 deals 25,288 with firing line. For the record, the 964 version dealt a whopping 101 damage more. 5 shots is 126,440 damage in 4.66 seconds, DPS of 27,133. If we use our 964 version, our DPS is 27,241. Our charge speed increased, and our DPS dropped a little bit, and that trend will continue. 533 charge speed at 960 deals 26,079 damage with firing line. 5 shots is 130,395 damage in 4.83 seconds, DPS of 26,996. So just on this alone, it's pretty safe to assume that you want a faster charging line in the sand if you want higher DPS. However, for greater total damage, if each individual shot counts and time is not a factor, you want slower charging. But, for example, is a 300 DPS difference really that noticeable in the grand scheme of the game? A 1.2% difference in this case? Absolutely not. Let's throw some mods into the mix. Boss Spec and Backup Mag. With our 466 line in the sand with Boss Spec, no firing line, our damage is 21,227 per shot. If we want to add our 25% bonus with firing line, we can, but for this test, it's not really needed. 106,135 damage in 5 shots, divided by 4.5 seconds, 23,586 DPS. With Backup Mag, we get a 6th shot, which now requires 5.5 seconds of time commitment for lower damage per shot. 19,697 times 6 is 118,182 damage divided by 5.5 seconds. That's 21,488 DPS, which is about 2,000 lower than Boss Spec. So if I'm looking to use this thing for boss damage, Boss Spec is looking like the play. Is there any combination of line in the sand perks that could beat the 466 speed Boss Spec version? Well, the only one that I can really imagine is a 500 charge speed, 6 in the mag, Boss Spec version, maybe with Rapid Hit. That's a Charge Masterwork with Ionized Battery and Rapid Hit, and Firing Line if you want that. I have this roll, but I didn't want to spend 17 cores on it, so I simulated it instead. 6 shots at 500 charge speed takes 5.72 seconds to perform. With Boss Spec, we are dealing 21,913 damage per shot, giving us 131,478 damage in that amount of time. So it sounds like it could beat it, but we end up with 22,985 DPS, which is 600 DPS less than our 466 charge version. What about over the long term? Let's say 15 shots, 3 magazines worth. Who is the winner there? Well, I'm gonna spare you here. I did 2 simulations, one with the 466 charge speed and one with the 566 charge speed. And over the course of 15 shots for each of the weapons, both with Rapid Hit, the DPS difference between the two was 43 damage per second in favor of the 566. This is a number so small that it could have been influenced by my potentially non-perfectly timed shooting. We're talking fractions of seconds here. So you could grab a 566 line in the sand compared to a 466 and it would literally not make a difference there. However, the amount of times you're shooting 15 linear fusion shots in a row at Rapid Hit times 5 is probably not that often, and I prefer higher DPS than total damage most of the time. When it comes to auto-loading holster versus firing line, we're going to shave a generous, what I believe to be generous, 2 seconds off of our total reloads. I'm assuming you're playing very well. And firing line still blows auto-loading holster out of the water by about 2,000 DPS. In fact, I think for auto-loading holster to beat firing line in terms of DPS, you would need to be able to fire 15 shots faster than the game actually allows you to shoot this gun. That's not to say that auto-loading holster is a bad get, because in stuff where you can't be next to teammates all the time for DPS, firing line does literally nothing. Alright, so we have our firing line DPS numbers floating around 27,000. How does that fare against some other weaponry? We talked about Soul Survivor earlier in the video, so let's test against that. Soul Survivor at 960 does 14,322 damage per shot without firing line. We'll just multiply by 25% to get our firing line damage value, which would be 17,902. I took 5 shots, equal to our line in the sand shooting for now. 17,902 times 5 is 89,512 damage, which is well below our total damage from earlier. But we're shooting at a rate of 90 RPM, and we can shoot 5 shots with the 5th shot landing in 2.67 seconds at max rate of fire, which gets us DPS of 33,525, which is substantially higher than Line in the Sand's best tests. Not to mention that I have triple tap on my Soul Survivor, which enables me to shoot for even longer without having to reload. That means even more DPS for Soul Survivor if you have those perks. And I wasn't using boss spec either. 2 big distinctions to make though. Soul Survivor is far more difficult to farm for in terms of time investment, while you can get up to 4 Line in the Sand fusions for about 10 minutes of work. The other distinction is that one uses special ammo, Soul Survivor, while Line in the Sand uses power ammo, which is much less common to pick up. How about against the holy grail of linear fusions, Sleeper Simulant? Sleeper did not get the linear fusion precision damage buff, so let's see how it's doing. 34,201 damage per shot with a magazine of 3 shots with a charge speed of 773 because we have the Catalyst. We get a time of 3.36 seconds from the first charging of the shot to the 3rd shot leaving the magazine. 34,201 times 3 is 102,603 divided by 3.36 seconds gets us DPS of 30,536. But keep in mind that this DPS value is right before our DPS nosedives because of the animation of the 3rd shot and the reload. So while it does technically outperform Line in the Sand under 1 magazine conditions, it's not by a ton. Not to mention that Sleeper is an exotic, and I have the Catalyst too. Without the Catalyst, these numbers get even closer. Now, just for fun, we'll test against one of the current champions, Izanagi's Burden, since I heard some rumblings very early in the season that Line in the Sand was actually out DPSing Izanagi's Burden. The old Burden deals 15,158 damage per shot, getting 4 shots per mag. That's 60,632 damage in 2 seconds, which is 30,316 DPS, still not beating out Line in the Sand, although it's close. The clip that I used in the video was 2.33 seconds for 4 shots, which actually tanks our DPS down to 25,989. So if you're not firing at maximum rate of fire with Izanagi's, then Line in the Sand is better, again, assuming you're firing at the maximum rate of fire. But we're going to test the real Izanagi's. With a Catalyst, with Honed Edge times 4, we get 67,117 damage in a single shot. But we're going to fire off 5 shots to get a really good comparison, reloads and all. It takes 9.72 seconds to fire 5 Honed Edge times 4 shots using the same timing as earlier. 335,585 damage in 9.72 seconds is 34,525 DPS, a pretty notable increase compared to Line in the Sand's best DPS window. The difference here is that with Izanagi's, we're now completely out of ammo, which might seem like a win for Line in the Sand. But to equal Izanagi's damage, we would need to fire 14 Line in the Sand shots, which takes considerably longer to do. All in all, is Line in the Sand the new god tier damage weapon? No. But it can at the very least compete with something like Soul Survivor, and if linear fusions happen to get another buff, or something gets nerfed, or something happens, then Line in the Sand with Firing Line and Rapid Hit might become a better option. Based on what we saw here, it seems like the best bang for your buck will be a Charge Masterwork accelerated coil, rapid hit, firing line version of the weapon. Pretty specific. However, because the variations don't have massive differences between them, especially over the long term, any rapid hit firing line version will work just fine. I've very frequently seen feedback saying that linear fusions should just be moved to the special ammo slot and taken out of the power slot due to their weakness. I know I've seen this feedback for swords as well, and while I would agree with this more than I would agree with swords, I just don't know if throwing underperforming weapons into other weapon slots is the best idea. At the moment, it sure seems like linears could be dropped into the special slot for PvE solely based on their damage alone. I don't know the ramifications of what would happen if linears were moved. Arbalest is already in the special slot and doesn't really seem to cause too many problems in PvE, so maybe it wouldn't be so bad. I just don't know enough to say whether it would be a good or bad idea. Anyway, that's what I have for you guys on Line in the Sand. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, a positive rating is appreciated. I'll see you next time.